So, welcome to Dancing in the Daily, a home for change agents, caretakers, healers, and everyday community builders who are working to call in more love, care, and joy into our world. Today, I am so excited to welcome Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, a political economist whose research focuses on community economic development and the solidarity economy. She wrote the now classic book, Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Thought and Practice, which she told me will soon be releasing its 10th anniversary edition, which is so amazing and exciting. Makes my heart so full. Thank you so much, Dr. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to talk with you and be here.
Yes. Now, I am so fortunate I've been able to meet with you in person. You are such a loving reflection of your work, right? You work about you write about mutuality, about community. And I remember being a college student at NYU, and my professor was able to put me in contact with you. And I was just a 20-something-year-old confused and asking questions about the economy and capitalism and what are alternatives and how can we imagine something else. And being able to speak to you about your research and cooperativism gave me that hope that I needed to just practice, right? Try something else.
Let's do it.
Yes. So I'm so grateful for who you are and all that you represent.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. Let me just say that is because of my parents and my upbringing. My parents were both academics and professionals. My mother, a pediatrician. My father is still alive at 102. And he's an educational psychologist and an expert in urban minority education. But one of the things they taught was that knowledge has responsibility, and that it's not enough to be well educated or even to know something, whether it's formal education or not. It doesn't matter unless you practice it, share it, and use it to make things better.
Wow.
I always felt like it was my duty, no matter what I did or what I knew, to pass it on, to share it, to try to do something with it. I'm actually an introvert, so I would rather, when I was a teenager, I just wanted to be a hermit and live on an island somewhere so I didn't have to deal with people because I was so shy. But I couldn't do that, because I realized I was a well-educated person with information and ideas, and that I couldn't just squirrel away. That I had a legacy to follow and and a culture to represent and ancestors to represent.
Oh my goodness!
I also became a mother, and as a mother, you can't kind of hide in the shadows. You have to be an activist as a parent.
Oh, wow.
Was thrust into all this. So thank you for saying that it's working and that you feel that I'm approachable and that, I'm sharing my knowledge. I really appreciate that.
Yes. I mean, your legacy is so wealthy. And I use that word, intentionally. It's interesting because I think there's so much rhetoric around, generational wealth and legacy. And for many people, that only means money, or it's really framed in that way. But I think, what you talked about, the legacy that your parents sharing with you, and now you are sharing with so many others, right? Your biological children, and certainly your spiritual and cultural children as well.
I'm trying. That's what my mother always said. We do what we're supposed to do. We do our best.
Oh my goodness. Well, I want to hear more about your childhood, actually. And I'm so curious about the childhood experiences that you had that helped to inform or inspire your thinking about cooperation and cooperativism.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is that I actually grew up in an intentional community that was incorporated as a cooperative. So
Wow.
it's I guess it's a housing cooperative, but not in the sense of we think of apartment buildings and condo kind of cooperatives. These were everybody owned their individual homes and a plot of land, but it was in a community that had communal property that every homeowner had a share in. We
Okay.
elected a board to decide what to do with that communal property. It had an athletic field on it. They created a pond. And so we had swimming. They hired a lifeguard every year.
Oh, wow.
And also the neighbors, some years, the neighbors all created like a summer camp for us. So I remember one year, different neighbors, like each week we did different things. One woman was a journalist, so she had us do a newsletter and taught us a little journalism. One woman was a potter, and so she taught us how to do ceramics. Two other people taught us different kinds of cooking and baking. So we were a tight-knit community in that sense. The community actually started as an interracial, religiously tolerant and anti-war community in the late 1940s. My parents joined it in the 1950s. We declared ourselves a nuclear-free zone in the 60s and things like that. So I did grow up with activists, with people who believed in civil rights, women's rights, and cooperation. But I hadn't thought of cooperation as an economic tool in those days. I thought of it more as a social, sort of a social and a civic and social kind of activity. But my parents were social activists, but they really were intersectionalists before we had that term.
Interesting.
So they believed not just that we needed political rights for civil rights, and they were civil rights activists. They helped to start the local NAACP chapter in my town, that kind of thing. But they also believed that you couldn't achieve full racial justice without economic justice.
Okay.
They taught us about economic alternatives, about economic justice. We talked about economic things at the dinner table. They were also one of those families where we always had to have dinner together. And we had conversations. So we talked about ideas, current events.
Yes.
As, any personal things at the dinner table. My parents were also basically feminists, right? They believed in gender justice and gender rights, and abortion rights and women's equality.
Yes.
They were also anti-war activists. So we were, early on, we were on picket lines. We were also pro-unions.
Wow.
Picket lines. We were at demonstrations for civil rights, for anti-war demonstrations, for women's rights. So we were a very active family. My parents were very activist scholars, activist professionals.
So you were built for this.
So, yeah, I almost didn't have any choice, but I also grew up to understand it and feel comfortable. In fact, sometimes I was more comfortable in those settings than in other kinds of settings.
Okay.
My parents also taught me to analyze, right? To look for root causes and
that's good.
analysis, not just to have gut reactions. That it was okay to understand gut reactions, but it was important to get to the details, to get to understanding systemic, because we wouldn't really you can't make real change unless you get to systemic. And then the final thing I would like to say is my parents also considered themselves humanists in the sense that human beings can use collective action to make change, that human beings collectively are stronger than anything else, but also that we need to treat each other humanely. And as human beings, they were always about, even if you had an argument, it was an argument about issues, not about person, right? So it wasn't an argument against a person. It was always argument to try to talk about an issue or a principle or that kind of thing, and that we should treat people with respect, even if we didn't agree with them politically or socially, that kind of thing. So that it was also just this strong sense of what it means to be a human being, and that's what we were striving for, right?
Oh my goodness.
Human beings that we could be.
Yes.
And my mother was also an early environmentalist. So early on, we were concerned about the environment, organic foods, recycling. My mother actually used to walk 3 miles a day, and on her walk, she would help the neighbors to recycle if she saw they hadn't recycled some of their garbage and things. So, yeah,
that is beautiful.
That's what I mean by a family that saw the intersections of everything, right? That we couldn't thrive as human beings unless all these other pieces, including paying attention to and Mother Earth and being respectful of Mother Earth and cleaning Mother Earth up.
Yes.
We're all part of it. So I really didn't have much of a chance to.
Well, we are also fortunate. Yes. We give thanks to your parents for all of the beauty that they poured into their children, which is now, again, being continued on in such a powerful way that we all get to benefit and receive from. And I love what you said, that term of intersectionalist. And because I feel like that's a term that we really could uplift. Right now, just a few days ago, was watching an interview on a YouTube channel that's focused around Black people building wealth. And the guest was, a very prominent kind of nonprofit figure in the US. And he was talking about moving from a nonprofit context to really focusing on capital and how that's where the power was, and economic power. But it was a very either or kind of conversation. I thought to myself, we need it all, right? Like we need all of it, And so I love what you were able to say, that generations prior had already acknowledged that we need the full spectrum. Yes, we need the economic power. We need the civil rights, right? We need the cultural power, the spiritual power. Holistically, we need all of it, social, all of it working together. So I love that term, intersectionalism. I'm going to take that with me.
Right. And really, I learned from one of my friends to talk about, our goal is human perfectibility, in that sense of humans being able to live our best lives without taking away from somebody else's best life, and without taking away from the planet, the liveliness of the planet, because we can't live our best lives without the planet.
Yes.
And the other thing I forgot to say about my parents, so I probably already said too much, is my mother, as a pediatrician, was also very concerned with health and health justice, right? And so again, wellness came into that, right? We also can't be activists. We can't do the things we need to do if we're not healthy and well, and other people can't live their best lives if they're not healthy and well. And my father was also an ordained minister. So even though he was practicing, even though he was more of a humanist, he was also very spiritual in terms of our, what it means to be beings in this universe.
Yes.
And how important it is for us to recognize the spiritual side as well as the intellectual side, as well as the physical health side.
Oh, how beautiful. And I love that. The last thing I too want to say is I love that they were able to come together, how beautiful their co-creation by coming together, the family, again, that they were able to create. And I mean, again, look at their legacy, look at their impact. How beautiful. I am just so inspired. I needed that. Now, I am curious so you mentioned that you grew up in this experience of cooperation, right? And intersectionality. What made you want to lean into economics, right? How did you move into economics?
Yeah, so that one took me a while, actually. I was really early on interested in writing. I used to write poetry from about 8 years old or something. Actually, I orally told my family short stories from when I was about 3. I think the first short story I told them one day when we were at the beach near a lighthouse was about a ghost in a lighthouse or something. So I always had wanted to be a writer. I discovered poetry, I think around 8 or 9, and certainly by 11 I was writing poetry through my 20s, pretty much. And I ended up majoring in literature because I loved writing so much, theater and novels and short stories and poetry. But I paired it, I double majored in African American studies because I was so interested in our communities and how to make change in our communities and that kind of thing. So I was really a humanities person.
Okay.
But again, because of the things we talked about at the dinner table and the things my parents wanted us to think about, I always had this understanding about economic justice. And so two things made me decide to get a PhD in economics and kind of switch my academic focus. After college, I lived in Belize for a while, and I was mostly doing educational research, some other stuff, but I also ended up in journalism and was working with a newspaper in Belize in Central America. And I realized the editorials, when I was the one who needed to write the editorials I wanted to write were all about economic inequality and poverty and things like that. And so I realized I needed to know more about it. But also I had worked for the Children's Defense Fund. So then I got a master's in education because I thought I wanted to teach.
Okay.
And I got into child advocacy instead of teaching because at that time I didn't really think I was a good teacher. And I worked for the Children's Defense Fund. And at the Children's Defense Fund, I realized, because actually Marion Wright Edelman, the president and founder, used to talk to us all the time about it wasn't enough to do the analysis and even to get policies passed if you didn't get the budget allocations.
Okay.
The money behind the policies,
yes,
you hadn't won yet.
That's right.
Steps to every fight, right? The first fight was to get the policies right, to get people to agree this policy is needed, we need to do this and this. But if you didn't then get the budget allocation, the policy would never be implemented or couldn't be implemented right or whatever. So she also got me thinking back to all my other roots about the economic, so where the economics fit in, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So that and my realizing I wanted to write more about how to stop inequality, economic inequality, and that kind of thing. I realized, okay, I need training in this. I already had a master's in education. I already had a BA, as I said, in literature and Black studies. So I was like, okay, well, the next step is a PhD. So let me do a PhD in economics, which a lot of people thought I was crazy. They didn't even think, how could I do economics after just doing literature and education. But I was able to get the master's and the PhD in economics.
Amazing.
Start to study economic systems and understand. I really wanted to understand why economics was curtailing elimination of poverty.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when you think about and I found out it was because of neoclassical economics and capitalism, right? That's the systems we live in, right? So when you think about how to eradicate poverty, right? If you really, again, study the systems, the systemic aspect of it, right? Most people are poor because they're not paid enough for the work they do, right?
Yes.
Now that's not what capitalism tells you, right? Capitalism tells you they're lazy, they're untrained, right?
Yes.
They miss too many days at work. They do unskilled work that doesn't, bring in much money. They have all these excuses. But if you really look at it, right, people are poor because they're not paid properly for their work they do, right? And whether that's home care and caring work that women do, whether it's teaching or caring for the elderly, right? All those jobs are totally underpaid.
Yes.
Or even factory work or whatever, right? Capitalism works because you underpay your workers, right? You minimize your costs to make your profits, right? So the whole mode of capitalism is that you underpay for everything, your products and your labor, right?
Yes.
But if we were paid for all the work we do, if we were paid properly for it, then nobody would be poor because we all do work, right? Even people unemployed do work.
Yes.
They do caring work, they do work at home, they do work in their communities, they do civic work, right? So even if, right, so if we paid people properly or covered the essentials for what people need, regardless of whether which kind of work they did, then people would be poor. So that's what I mean by I was trying to understand, right? So why every time when we think about ways to address poverty, affordable housing or whatever, what gets in the way is that housing is a commodity that capitalists want to make a profit off of, right? That's why we don't have affordable housing. So capitalism is in the way, right? Economic.
Yes.
So I was like, okay, I need to study this to figure out, well, how do we get around that? Why is it always the economics, right? Because you could get people to sit in a room and agree everybody should have a home, nobody should be malnourished, right? Whatever. But then when you go to do it,
yes,
the problem is capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to study capitalism. So I deliberately found a program where I could study political economy, which is a critique of capitalism and a different way of looking at the economy.
Okay.
And I wanted then to be able to use economics to help us solve the problem. Because as I said, I felt like that was one of the major obstacles.
Yes, yes. Oh my goodness. We are so grateful to you all for that work, because I think, as you mentioned, the field of economics really does double down on capitalism and maintaining these structures. And even now we see it when you're watching the news and the way they talk about the economy. It really is hard to imagine other possibilities outside of these structures, because the mass media kind of speaks about it in a way that really says, oh, this is the way things have to be,
Right. Yes. And capitalism pervades everything, right? It's not just that it pervades mass media and how mass media interprets things. It also, right, the capitalists buy the politicians, right? They pay for the campaigns and buy the politician. So it skews all the things that our elected officials do. And it limits who even runs or can run, because it makes it so expensive to run if you don't have the backing from some capitalists. It skews what policies can get passed and what money can get allocated to things, because, right, the capitalists and their flunkies, determine those kinds of things. So it's not even just in the economic sphere. It's that, and healthcare, right? Healthcare is so infused with capitalism again. We can't, and we saw that with the pandemic, right? I mean, why does the United States have some of the highest, or had the highest rates of COVID deaths of any country in the world? What sense does that make?
Right.
It's supposed to be the biggest, best, strongest, smartest, most affluent country in the world, and we can't keep our population safer from a pandemic than other countries that have so-called less than we have. But it's because we have capitalist system. We don't have a real public health system, and we don't have health equity.
Yes. Well, it's interesting too, because and you mentioned, multiple systems, and then also education. And that's one of the things you and I have talked about, before. That's really how we start our conversation, thinking about how young people and how their kind of imaginations of who they are, how they define themselves, and how they identify their value in the world is shaped in the school system, right? To focus so much on, their value as how much money am I earning? Yeah.
And also the schools, the way we even teach, right? And how we teach children. One of my pet peeves about schooling is that technically we're training children to accept their position as low-wage workers, right? And if you think about, especially inner city schools and schools teaching non-whites, what are like the three most important things? First is coming on time to school. I know my children in Washington, D.C., I was first flabbergasted and then just so angry, because they cared more about whether the kids got there on time than whether they learned. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the things they did for kids that were late was put them in a 2-hour detention. So if they were 10 minutes late, they then missed 2 hours of class instruction sitting in the auditorium in detention to punish them for being late.
Wow.
But meanwhile, 10 minutes late, they would only have missed taking your coats off, attendance roll or something, right?
Yes.
But now they missed 2 hours of instruction.
Yes.
I mean, it just made no sense to me, but that's because the school's intention is to treat them right. That's you're going to be docked when you go to work. If you go to a regular job, right, you're going to be docked if you're late. So they're trying to, right, they're basically trying to help the capitalists to train good workers for the capitalists, right?
Yes.
And so that's the first thing, right? The second thing is they're trained to just sit quietly and regurgitate what they hear, right? Not to think for themselves, not to collaborate with other people to come up with a better answer, but just to sit quietly listen to the teacher. You know, if you have a question, it better be a simple, good question, but don't ask too many questions, right? Don't come up with any ideas of your own. Regurgitate what you were told, right?
Yes. Yes.
And then I don't even know what the third thing is I was going to say, but you get the idea.
Yes. Yes.
So who would even want to go to school? I mean, it's amazing that we have kids that want to go to school under those circumstances.
That's right.
And I guess in general, the schools also just teach capitalism as the only economic system also.
That's right.
So I've been arguing that we really need to start teaching about cooperative economics and solidarity economics from kindergarten, because actually kindergarten is the place where they separate, right? It's okay. You have to cooperate when you play with other people, right? Be nice to other kids, share your blocks, whatever. But when it comes to so that's for play. But when it comes to the serious stuff and academics and learning, oh my gosh, no.
What about you?
If you talk to somebody else, it's cheating in school.
Yes.
Right? You try to share information or even share a pencil sometimes, you're reprimanded.
That's
so
right.
Now cooperation is only about play, right? But for the serious stuff, oh, no. Right?
Yes.
And that's what they teach in kindergarten, because you don't pass kindergarten if you don't learn that.
Yes.
You learn how to sit quietly and not talk to your neighbor. You don't get out of kindergarten.
That's right.
So then
That's
how, by the time they're 13, 15, 20, if we're trying to get them into co-ops, how do we expect them to start cooperating with each other when they spend all those years being reprimanded for talking to their neighbor or collaborating to find an answer?
Yes. Yeah. And now getting opportunities to problem solve and face challenges, together, because usually it's the teacher who's, okay, something happened in the classroom. Now the teacher's going to just choose and they're going to decide who to reprimand and how to handle the situation.
Versus, so it's very authoritarian.
Yes. That's actually one of the things I really wanted to dig in with you around is this kind of the mindset and also cultural identity. Right. And, looking at your amazing book, and I love your writings about mutual aid societies, because I think you take this idea of cooperativism, but you expand what that could include and what that could mean from a historical perspective. Right. And I am curious about the mindset, the belief system, ways of thinking that would inspire someone to engage in a mutual aid society, right? So thinking through your book, thinking through the history of African-American cooperatives and mutual aid societies, when you were doing that research, did you find, what was the thought, the ways of thinking that were going into participants in these spaces? How did they see themselves? What was their own identity? And then how do they understand the value of mutual aid?
Yeah, the more I've studied mutual aid, and actually I think I've learned more about it since I published the book, the more I've studied it, the more I understand that mutual aid, economic cooperation are actually our first economic systems, right? It's the ways that our first societies survived, worked together and survived, right? When you think about early hunters and gatherers, they did that together, right? They hunted together. It wasn't about one person hunting. Everybody who was able to hunted together and shared what they caught, right?
Yes.
and they gathered together, whatever berries or whatever they were doing, right? Everybody gathered together, put it all in a basket and distributed it out, right? So our nature, right? Human nature is to share, to pool resources, to share, to work together. Again, it's over the centuries, and especially with the ascendancy of capitalism, that again, that was beaten out of us. They're told that it was too primitive or inefficient or whatever, right? So when I talk to people now, I actually talk about what I call everyday acts of solidarity.
Okay.
I believe that we naturally do it. We just don't always notice it, recognize it, or have a name for it.
Okay.
But think about carpooling, right? You don't have a car, but I do. So I drive you to the store. I drive your kids to school. But then there's reciprocity. You usually do something for me. Sometimes bake for me, or you have me to dinner, or you take my kids after school if I'm not home yet or something, right? So there's all these reciprocal acts of solidarity that we do kind of as human beings. In fact, we usually think of people as not very social or not human, the ones who don't participate in those kinds of things, right? But every day in our lives, most of us have those kinds of reciprocal relationships we have with people, and barter relationships. I help you, help me. And then many of us also do the pooling, not just the barter, but the pooling, where we actually pull together the resources. We have groups that actually form these asusus and revolving loan funds within families or within neighbors or whatever. We have people who just naturally, like, I'll bring this, you bring that, if we do potluck dinner. So I try to show people that we actually do already, right? That kind of mutual aid is kind of built into human beings' DNA. It's when we are forced to or choose to ignore that DNA part of us, right? Because we think it's not civilized or it's not effective or whatever. But then in hard times, we almost always go back to it. So again, I noticed a huge rise in mutual aid, formal and informal mutual aid, among especially people of color, but mostly everybody during the COVID pandemic. So many organizations started, Black mutual organizations in different cities and different, right? People were helping each other as best they could, because that's what we do. Especially, you can see it in crises, because that's when it seems so necessary that you can't stop yourself, right? When times are good, we don't always do it, though. We have some, I know some families who came to me and said they've always had a college fund among the family, right? At each family, an extended family puts certain money aside, and then whichever family needs it to go to college, they use some of it or whatever. We've got families that have always done sick funds like that. So we know that we naturally do it as human beings. And so looking at it through the ages, right, we found, especially during times of stress and crises, but also during good times when people were thinking about how to achieve the things they need to achieve, they often still would do it together, do it as a collective. So we have great examples throughout history of mutual aid, Black mutual aid societies, which is what I studied. I think it's really interesting. Somewhere I wrote once that the second oldest mutual aid society that we know about was the now I forgot the name, but in Philadelphia, the Free Africa Society or something like that, actually was the group that created the first Black church, right? The AME Zion Church. Right? Started by a mutual aid society, one of the oldest ones, Black ones in our country, right? So again, this connection between the economics and the spirituality and the socialness, right? Being human beings, right? We also have one of the first and largest Black banks was started by a women's mutual aid society in Richmond, Virginia. It was called this Penny Savings Bank at first, and then it consolidated with the other small Black banks in Richmond and became one of the largest Black banks. Some of the largest Black insurance companies started out as mutual insurance, which are essentially co-ops, essentially mutual aid societies. So we see these ways that people realized pooling their resources not only helped with their immediate needs, but helped to position them to create both community wealth and individual wealth in these ways, because it enabled them to create larger structures, which gave them more opportunity to do more and provide more services and work more with more people, that kind of thing. And so I don't know if that gives you enough examples. I didn't really name a lot of mutual aid societies, but you get the idea. The other fascinating thing about Black mutual aid societies is to find out how many were started and run by Black women. One study I saw said about 60 to 80% of the mutual aid societies were started and run by Black women.
Wow.
Everybody kind of recognized that, and not just started by Black women, but run by Black women. Also, a lot of the revolving loan funds, the Isusus, are run by women. And a friend of mine in Canada has a whole study she calls Banker Ladies.
Okay.
So many of the treasurers of these mutual aid societies are women. They were controlling the money, and people trusted them to hold their pooled resources until everyone decided what to do with it. So it's also a fascinating history about Black women's leadership, and the way that Black women recognize what's needed in their community and do what's needed and do it together. Don't need any glory from it. Just do what they need to do to make sure their communities are healthy.
How beautiful. How beautiful. I love that. I'm wondering, I have some ideas in my brain, but why do you think, right? Or perhaps your friends' research, why women or why Black women? What do you think?
Well, I think that women in general, but Black women in particular, and I have another friend who just actually wrote an article about this, about Black women's community work needs to actually be seen as labor because of how productive it is in terms of other things. Their community work is not only about caring work and helping everybody be healthy and happy in their communities, but it also sets the stage for and allows for people to do wage work.
Yes.
It allows for the communities to be in better shape so that they get more outside resources coming in. And so we really need to uplift and recognize that women's community work. She said too often, it took a long time for us to recognize Black women in formal labor situations, right? We mostly saw them as domestic workers, but we never gave enough value to the domestic work. But now we're also missing the community work, the community side. And so we need to think not just about formal labor, not just about home, what happens in the home, but what happens in the community.
Oh, that is so good.
Yeah, that's Nina Banks' work on that. But again, the notion is because Black women have kind of always had the burden, right? In fact, because most of our early work as enslaved people was either in the fields or domestic work, because as women in general, we're always doing caring work, right? Women understand what's happening in communities and what the needs are. But women are also what we call agentic. We're agents. We take charge of things. And so because the burdens are usually on us, because we're people who already are in the middle of doing that kind of work. We're nurturers, we're carers. The burdens are already there. Often in the Black community, the men were either having to work so hard that they couldn't pay that much attention to community or to home, or they were so beaten down and oppressed that they often weren't psychologically able to do right. The Black women just kind of stepped in to all those places in addition to the roles they already had. They kind of also had to step in sometimes. And also the white oppressors so ignored caring spheres and the community spheres that Black women's work was kind of under the radar, and so they weren't as attacked for it.
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So if you put all those things together, then of course it's natural that Black women, but natural in the sense of given all the conditions we were under, right? So in some ways it was easier for Black women to do that kind of work because they were under the radar. Nobody expected them to be very agentic or to be organizers or to do anything. It reminds me actually of a great study I just heard. Actually, this is something I heard from a woman named Bonnie Greer, who's an African American who actually moved to the UK and works in the British Museum, but she did a podcast on African history. And one of the early podcasts I heard her do was on slave revolts. And she found two women historians who reread all the ship manifests for the slave ships. And found a pattern that nobody else had noticed because we're so we're such a patriarchal society. And what she found was, I think it's to a ship, all the ships that had slave revolts had women, African women on the slave ships. There were a lot of slave ships that didn't have any African women because at first the slave trade only took men because they thought men could do the work they needed and all that kind of thing. But anyway, she found out that all the ship manifests that had insurrections and slave revolts also were ones that had women on board.
Oh, wow.
And what they found was the women instigated in several ways. One, some of them were just warriors and got the men interested, but also because the women were used for sex and things, they had more access to the men and more access to the upper levels of the ship, so they could overhear things.
Oh, wow.
They could learn the language. They knew where the weapons were, that kind of thing, because the white men just wanted them near to rape them and stuff and didn't think that they had any brains or anything like that. So then they weren't, they weren't penned up as much. They weren't always in the bin. So it turns out they had more opportunity to start the insurrections, to inform with the men, to get the men's stuff. And plus they had reason because they were being so sexually exploited. They had reason to want to revolt.
Yes.
It was a fascinating study. I just heard it like last year.
Oh my goodness.
I started telling my students about it. One, because, this woman was like, the male historians had that information, but because they also never thought about women, they never thought about looking at the connection between women and the slave revolts. It was only women historians who said there's got to be something else for why these boats had insurrections and not every boat had an insurrection or whatever, right?
Yes.
So then they realized, and the more they started reading, the more they understood that this different. So again, it's that kind of under the radar position of women, especially that white men don't notice, that allows women to do all kinds of things that we wouldn't normally think that they could either do or would do, right? And so I feel like this is happening in communities, right? Women are very agentic. We're taking charge, we're doing all this stuff, but not everybody's going to notice because who cares about what happens at home or in communities or whatever, unless it impacts their profits.
Yes. Oh, that is so good.
About it. Right. So anyway, that's my compilation of all the different theories I've heard about why women are so strong in mutual aid, why women are so strong in community economic development spheres, that kind of thing.
Yes. Oh, no, that was such a powerful insight. That's why I love speaking to you, because I asked one question and you're just like, yes, what rich information. And I thank you for saying that, because one of the things that I love about collective courage is that, giving reverence to our ancestors and really honoring the powerful and rich legacy that we have. It pains me that even today, we can still have really just sad and harmful rhetoric that limits the power and the strength of who we are as people, as human beings, right? What we have to offer to the global story. And so hearing what you just said, I think is such a powerful and beautiful reminder to all Black people, and even people who aren't Black, right? Of like, wow, look at the human spirit, right? Like the human desire for liberation. It's within all of us, right?
Well,
And
absolutely,
that's a legacy that we're built on.
Right. Absolutely. And I mean, part of why I wrote the book was because I wanted people to understand this legacy. Because a lot of people, when I first started saying, oh, we should do co-ops will help your community, co-ops, right? And people were like, oh no, Black people don't do co-ops. Oh, that's not right. And it never made sense to me. And so partly I just wanted to excavate that legacy so people could see it. But also I started to learn that some of it's about labeling and terminology also, right? So that's why I started talking about everyday acts of solidarity and things like that, because the terminology was also getting in the way. When people heard co-ops, they were thinking about a white-owned food co-op or something. They weren't even thinking about credit unions. They weren't thinking about other kinds of economic cooperation until I started using different terms or telling stories. So that's the other thing I learned about how important it was to tell stories and connect stories.
Yes.
Like one of my favorite stories when I talk about Black women's leadership in co-ops was the Combahee River Colony Co-op. And it was really after I wrote the book. So I think I might just have one sentence in the book about it, but I learned later what important role Harriet Tubman played in freeing that community along the Combahee River in South Carolina during the Civil War, that allowed the women to then become a collective. So, Harriet Tubman, everybody knows, right? Such a warrior in terms of getting, enslaved people out of slavery and free. But she also was a nurse and a scout in the Civil War for the Union Army, right?
Yes.
I forget the story now, but it took her like 6 months to convince the Union Army that they should go up the Combahee River and free all those plantations there. But they finally agreed with her. She got 3 other guys and did all the reconnaissance. So they told the Union Army when it was right to go up there, and whatever. They went up there, they actually freed 750 Black people.
Wow.
Ran off the white plantation owners. The Black men, most of them joined the Union Army and left the women, the elderly, and the children on those plantations that had now been abandoned by the white masters. And the women started running the plantations as collective. And in addition, did crafts and started selling crops and crafts and stuff to keep their people going. But that combination, right, of the mighty warrior that Harriet Tubman was, right, and the strategist, right,
yes,
was freeing that land, and then what the women did once they had control of that land. It's just the whole story is just
so beautiful
story. And again, it shows those interconnections and the ways one thing that we do leads to another.
Yes.
I also tried. I wasn't always able to find those kind of connections, but I tried to see where, some civil rights activists or rhetoric also contributed to co-op work and stuff.
That intersection.
Right. We have some of that with SNCC workers. A lot of the SNCC workers also helped. In fact, John Lewis talks about it in his autobiography. One of his first jobs with SNCC was helping start co-ops.
Wow.
South and credit unions. I was able to see places where W.E.B. Du Bois, who also actually did write a book about Black economic cooperation, that helped me. And also he was one of the ones who helped me to understand the role of mutual aid. But he actually had a meeting in 1918, what he wanted to call the Negro Cooperative Guild. But the 12 men that he had at that meeting all went back to their towns and tried to start co-ops.
Yes.
So there's that connection. I thought that he and like Booker T. Washington never spoke, but then I found out that he and the people who were running the Black Business League that Booker T. Washington started were all on a panel together to choose the logo for Colored Merchants Association. That was a co-op
Mm.
of independent Black grocers. It was a co-op of independent Black grocers that actually was started by the very conservative Black Business League.
Yeah.
But they weren't so conservative they didn't understand the power of economic
Cooperation. Come on now.
right? And then they had all these leading Black figures, even ones that were supposed to not be speaking to each other, were all on the same panel deciding what should be the logo for this co-op. So just, trying to find those kinds of interconnections, and where I think it was in Chicago in the 30s, there was a Black affordable housing group that then started a food co-op. And anyway, just because, again, to explain how we don't just do one thing, right? We do multiple, because there's, again, the intersectionality of all these different issues. We engage in multiple ways to make our lives and our communities better. And
that's right.
Many of them, again, are about different ways to cooperate. So again, when we look so narrowly and only look for, okay, well, who are the quote unquote civil rights people? And they were just working on voting rights, but actually most of them were also under the radar working on economic stuff, and some of them were doing co-ops, and and so helping us to understand that having that narrow perspective means we miss so much that's what happens in our communities and what successes we have. And that was my other problem. I was so tired, especially in economics. All you hear about is the gloom and doom, how everything is bad, how bad the situation is for Blacks and Black workers and Black communities and whatever. And studying economic cooperation and the Black co-op movement just allowed me to stop wallowing in what was wrong and see where we could where things were working and what was right, and that people don't wallow, we resist, right? But again, we don't talk about that, right? We don't talk about agency and resistance. We talk about right? We just talk about ourselves as if we're victims, and other people talk about us as victims. Instead of talking about how, right, we're in bad situations, but what do we do when we're in bad situations? We all rise the best we can and try to get out of those situations. And most of the time we try to get out of them as a collective, as a group of people. It's the rare, again, the rare individual gets highlighted because that's capitalism. But if you really look at history, most of the times we work together. And most of the times we just don't turn over and die or allow people to victimize us. We try to do something about it as best we can, given the circumstances we have. So being able to study the ways that we tried to resist, the ways that we did resist, the ways that we built even in the worst circumstances, even when we didn't own our own, right? Even when we didn't own and control our own bodies, we were doing collective stuff and mutual aid. Right? Farming together on the side on Sundays so we had extra food. We were pooling the resources we could to buy each other's freedom. Right? So even when we had nothing, right, we were doing things together and making something out of that, and still raising children with values. And so that to me was so important, especially as an economist, because as I said, most of the time, especially Black economists, were always just looking at what's bad. And I couldn't live like that. I couldn't make a career out of that.
Oh, I love it.
It was way too depressing. I had to look at what we do, how we rise above that, what we do, and what we are as agentic people who resist and build.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I mean, what an inspiration. I feel like that is a reminder and an affirmation that we need, especially during this time where, we see people talking about, the levels of financial anxiety. Right. We see people talking about even, the loneliness epidemic, right? The mental health crisis amongst adolescents. There is so much going on. But what you just shared is that message of hope that by working together, by collaborating, by cooperating in creative ways, whether that's starting an actual institution or just relationally, right? And in between people, that we absolutely can create the experiences, the communities, the worlds that we want to live in. So I just love your work so much.
Thanks. No. It's a pleasure to talk with you. You really you bring stuff out in me that I don't always say. So thank you for that.
Oh my goodness. Well, you have so much to be able to dig into. And before we go, because I want to honor your time, but I want to ask you a little bit even more about that inner work, right? And what is the inner work that you feel is required to be able to engage meaningfully in cooperation or in mutuality or in kind of even just the everyday acts of solidarity, right? And so I certainly have noticed, my background is also in kind of nonprofits and also education. And I've had beautiful experiences of collaboration. I've also seen people, because we are raised in an individualist society, it can be really hard to navigate conflict. So I'm curious,
Absolutely.
what can we do in terms of inner work? What practices, rituals, resources, what should we be doing on that front?
Yeah. Well, I was feeling guilty that I didn't say anything about how hard this is. I like to celebrate it. I like to make sure people know we can do it and we've done it, right? But then, my children used to say I was too Pollyanna-ish, though I'm not sure they even use that word. But, I was always too optimistic, too on the bright side. I always talked about what was possible, partly because that's how I make it through the world, right?
Yes.
I have to get up in the morning, and if I don't feel like some things are possible, it's hard to get out of bed, right?
Yes.
But
Yes.
partly it's because, again, I feel like we focus so much on the negative that we need that perspective, and then also, I've been learning more. About just putting it out in the universe, right? Putting the positive stuff out in the universe. So I also try to do that.
Yes.
But it is true that this is hard work. And so how do we get through the hard work? I think there's a couple of things. First thing is back to education and training.
Okay.
There are things we need to do, especially because we live in this capitalist, individualist world. There are things we have to do to retrain ourselves, right?
Yes.
To go back again to our DNA as cooperating mutual human beings. And so we have to learn how to address conflict in positive ways, because we are, again, we're so conflict averse as a society. I don't even know. I guess that's another symptom of capitalism. I'm not quite sure why, except that because capitalism is so traumatizing, that I guess, right, we're diverse because we're already so traumatized by everything else in the world, right? We don't feel like we can fight another fight.
Yeah.
Or any other fight,
Yeah.
So we have to learn conflict actually is not bad, right? What's bad is either avoiding it or that we approach it as being a problem, right? Right? As human beings and problem solvers, we're also supposed to embrace conflict, because conflict means there are 2 or 3 different perspectives on something. And we need to tease out how to either reconcile them, how to understand them, or how to address them, so that when we come to a solution, it's a better solution and a stronger solution, and one that everybody can get behind. So if we think of conflict as giving us the opportunity to get to a better solution, a better answer, then we don't have to be so afraid of it. In fact, we should embrace it in the sense of we should want to get to it so that we can get to the better point.
That's so good. Oh, wow.
That's why some of us have always talked about dialectics, right? That understanding of you can't even get to good decisions, good solutions, if you don't have the challenges of the agitation or whatever, because that helps us, right? It's just how you manage it, right? Then we also need to understand how to bond together, how to build trust. I know there was one co-op, it was a co-op that was helping people to raise enough down payment to buy a house. So this was a co-op where people were putting in a lot of money each month. And so they realized they actually, before you join, you have to go through a bonding and a African trust building program weekend with them.
Oh, wow.
So that before you become a member, or as soon as you join, how to deal with each other and how to, right? Because there's so much, the money amounts were very high, and they wanted, and that group was able, they were so deliberate about making sure people understood how to work together, how to trust each other, that when they had one of the couples who lost their jobs and couldn't contribute, the co-op agreed to let the couple stay and actually help the couple to find work, find consulting work or something. So
yes.
they on their feet. So instead of saying, oh, you can't contribute, you're out, they
Right.
problem solved, right? What's the problem? They problem solved, they worked on it, they helped, and they used mutual aid again to just help that couple even stay in the co-op. So that be, that kind of level. But that takes deliberate, right? You have to be deliberate about recognizing that that's going to be an issue and figuring out different strategies and building those skills, right? How do you do trust building? How do you come to consensus? How do you address conflict? And now I like this term conflict transformation, right?
Ooh.
Because it's not even just conflict resolution, because that sounds again like you're just trying to come to some new compromise and everybody's losing. But conflict transformation is that transforming conflict into a better solution, right?
Yes.
So conflict transformation skills, consensus building skills, trust building skills are all going to be important, in addition to just learning how to do economic cooperation, how to do a business, right? So there's a lot of, we have to see ourselves as continuous learners. And again, not be afraid of that, not thinking about learning as just being formal education, but learning as what we do as human beings, again, to keep perfecting ourselves. See that our organizations have to be continuous learners. So we need that kind of attitude. And then the final thing is wellness. And this actually I learned from a nonprofit that's a community organizing group I work with in Washington, D.C. called Organizing Neighborhood Equity, 1DC. And we realized about 10 years ago, I guess, we had a platform that we were supporting right to housing, right to income, right to land. And then we added a right to wellness, because we realized how hard it is to organize, especially low-income communities, especially low-income Black communities. It's very hard to organize people to assert their right to equity and right to resources if they're so traumatized, both mentally and or physically, that they're not healthy enough to be advocates for themselves. Yes. So we realize that if we don't pay attention to wellness, we can't really achieve much else, right?
Yes.
We need to be healthy and well. And so we actually do we do some wellness exercises before each meeting, even sometimes it's just breathing or just stretching or whatever. We actually have a building now called the Black Workers and Wellness Center. And so it focuses on Black labor rights and labor rights, but we also do wellness, in that space, have a space for doing wellness. We've got a mindfulness session every third Thursday of the month.
Wow.
We're hoping to get some masseuses in there to do massages and things, but also just recognizing the work-life balance, that we need a work-life balance. And work can be your paid work or your volunteer work with the nonprofit, but trying to recognize that we have to figure out how to get more and more people to carry the water. So it's not just one person carrying the water. And how to make sure we pay attention to work-life balance. We also practice what's called appreciative inquiry. We're partnered with an appreciative inquiry partner. Another leader, all the leading members and staff and board members all have appreciative inquiry partners. And what you do with your partner is you meet about once a month and you talk about what have been your success. First, you start with successes. That's sort of the appreciation part. What you start with successes. Your partner also comments on what they think you have been your successes. You comment on it. But then you also talk about what have been your challenges, what could you do better at, but how can your partner and how can the organization help you to do better?
That's so good.
It's not even just a critical, it's not just constructive criticism, but it's really about building, right? Continuing to build. You're not in this alone. So whatever you're struggling with, what else can we help you with? How can we help you? So we start with what to appreciate, but then we get into the nitty gritty about how to do better and what can we all do as a community of people how do we help each other? So that
Yes.
kind of wellness, as well as thinking about other kinds of mental and physical wellness, I
That's
think
so
is also
good.
important, because this work is so hard. And
Yeah.
now, you and I earlier were talking about that rest is resistance. I'm starting to learn that too now.
Yes.
And
Trisha
how
Hersey.
important recognizing, right? Because especially us social activists, right? We always thought we couldn't rest, right? That there was everything was happening.
Mm.
We couldn't miss a beat.
Yeah.
We would stay up all night to do stuff, or or make sure, or stay up all night to do our activist work, because we spent all day doing our paid labor and our
Yeah.
family stuff, right? But we're also realizing that we're not any good if we're tired, if we're susceptible
Hmm.
to whatever. And so we're stronger if we also have this right balance, right? If we get
That's
enough,
right.
if we have a balance. And the other thing is, again, capitalism defeats us if we let it exhaust us. We already
Mm.
know that it traumatizes us, right? We're traumatized almost daily by it. But if we also
Yes.
let it exhaust us, then they've won, right?
Yes.
So we
Yes.
have to figure out how to be sustainable in this fight.
That's right. That's right. And doing that, as you said, together, giving each other opportunities to rest and creating space for each other to be able to do that. I do want to ask you, I promise only two more questions, because again, I want to be mindful of your time. I want to, before the closing question, I do want to ask you, following up to the last one, about ego.
Okay.
And how you see kind of ego showing up in some of this work, and then also how you've seen either yourself or organizations that you work with be able to move through some of that, because again, I coming from the nonprofit perspective, especially with that trauma, I'm sure you've heard of like founder syndrome, right?
Yeah.
Where people, you endure so much trauma trying to start something new, or trying to help your community, or trying to, impact or reach a goal, that you then, start to develop this kind of protective layer that feels like this ego that can also kind of overwhelm a group that might have initially started out kind of cooperatively and collectively, but then people kind of start to retreat into themselves. How have you seen ego kind of show up, in community work? And then again, if there are any kind of resources or tools or just examples you've seen of people being able to move through ego.
Right. So yeah, ego is definitely a challenge, especially again because of the kind of society we live in. I have two groups that have helped me work through that. The first one is again organizing neighborhood equity, 1DC, and partly it's because we had such a fantastic founder who refused to have ego in it. But also the group of us who ended up being in the organization around him, we actually transitioned him from being executive director to resource organizer, because he's actually a fantastic fundraiser. And so we said, okay, focus on that, but you don't need to be executive director anymore. And we transformed the organization to what we called shared leadership.
Okay.
But it's still difficult. And half of the problem was making the rest of the outside world understand that we were still functioning just as well, even though we didn't have an ED. But it also meant that our board, which we now call a shared leadership team, had to become a working board and take on a lot more management responsibilities. And we're still trying to figure that out. What we noticed there, even now, since we're a shared leadership team and whatever, we do have people who join for ego reasons. And if they can't transition themselves to thinking more about a team and how you share leadership and that kind of thing, then they usually don't last. But we also have tried again to do the trainings, right? Training about all these kinds of things, especially about consensus building. But we also try to pair, again, not just the appreciative inquiry pairs, but we also have like co-chairs of everything. This shared leadership team has a co-chair. And then we pretty much run by committee. The committees all are supposed to have co-chairs. So no one person is responsible, even when a committee or a committee chair is responsible for something, it's still not one person, right? We try to talk
Mm-hmm.
about the organization's accomplishments or a committee's
Yes.
accomplishment, but not one person's accomplishment. So it
Yes.
takes a lot of, again, deliberateness. It takes a lot of, we actually decided on terminology and define that terminology, and we have a whole terminology sheet we give to newcomers. This is what we mean by shared leadership. This is what we mean, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's a newish organization called Sociocracy, which is training people. Sociocracy is a way to do shared leadership through what they call circles, but it's also similar to this committee management by committee structure. And they have been training people. Some of our members have been getting trained in it and thinking about it. So sociocracy definitely helps organizations that want to be horizontal and democratically run on how to do that. They've got actual structures to help you figure out how to do it. And again, it's all about allocating decisions to committees, to, or what they call circles. Yes. And not feeling like any one person either has to or does make all the decisions, or even if you allocate a decision to one person, it's because the group said that one person is the right person, or that one position is the right position to make that decision. So again, very deliberate about how decisions are made, who weighs in, how everybody can weigh in. So again, how to come to consensus, how to make decisions collectively is very important in all those things. So that's part of it. But I'm also part of a group, I think we're called the Cooperative Leadership Group. And there's just 5 or 6 of us that talk about this about once a month. And again, this is about this notion that everybody's a leader. Right? And so it's not ego, because it's not you against everybody else or you better than everybody else. Everybody has a leadership role to play. What we have to do is help people figure that out. But also in shared leadership, we believe that leaders step up and step back, right? Yes. You might lead in this one project, or you might lead in this one area because you have expertise in it or interest in it or whatever, but that doesn't mean you're the leader of everything. It doesn't mean you make your decisions by yourself, right? And it doesn't mean that you're always necessarily going to be a leader. You might step up for one thing, but then step back, or you might step into a role, but start training other people. We also use a quote from Ella Jo Baker that a leader creates leaders. Yes. Right? So it's not that a leader leads other people, a leader creates leaders, right? So again, it's this notion that we're all leaders. We need to learn how to assert our leadership, how to step up, step back, when to be a leader, and then how to work with other people who are leaders, right? So we don't have followers, right? There's no followers. And that's back to my talk about agency, right? We have to see ourselves as agents and not see agency as bad, right? Especially that happens to little girls. A lot of times when little girls take agency, people try to beat them down. Oh, that's not ladylike, or that's right. But we have to stop that kind of language, and also stop seeing agency as either competitive or hostile, right? It's not about, again, us asserting ourselves as leaders, as agentic people, and not allowing ourselves to be victims, right? Agency is about helping our communities, helping our families, helping our communities, and we need to embrace that. If we see everybody as an equal agent, just some people have skills in different ways or interests in different ways, right? That's when the step up, step back. You can be a leader here. You don't have to lead over here. You're not in charge of anything, but you're leading and working with other people. You're creating other leaders as you do whatever. Even if you have to take on leadership, you're doing that and trying to create additional leaders. So we see that all as a process, right? That's the other thing, a process and a journey. That's the way to understand these things. And so then there is really no place for ego except the ego to want to be helpful, right? Want to participate, to want to be helpful. That's where the role of ego comes in. And it's hard in this world. I mean, sometimes you do want to be recognized more than you are, or you want, right? But we just we have to fight with ourselves on that a little bit and remember what the end goal is, right? The end goal is change for the better for everybody, right?
Yes, that's
Protecting
right.
ourselves as human beings so that
Mhm.
humanity can survive and thrive, right?
Yes. Ooh, the fullness of our humanity. Yes. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I am just, my heart is so full. My spirit is energized. I feel like you've given so many resources, tools, the blueprint. Like, oh my goodness. Now, the last question I want to ask before we close is, and I think you've already kind of shared a lot of this, but what excites you for our future, right? As we are working to build beloved community in this world, as we are working to build beloved community throughout the African diaspora, throughout African American communities, right? What is really exciting you right now?
Well, I'm very excited that through these last traumas of, the COVID pandemic and, white supremacist terrorism that's still here,
Mm-hmm.
we actually, I think, have increased our spirit for mutuality, mutual aid, collectivism.
Mm.
I feel like people are responding even more humanly, even more collectively. And so that really excites me. And especially I get excited when I see what our young people are doing. And
Yeah.
I've been telling people, in the book, I talk about three most prolific periods of Black co-op development: the 1880s, 1930s and 40s, 1960s and 70s. I think we're in a fourth period. The 2020s are a fourth period, and it has a lot of resonance to some of those other periods. But I see we're in another period. A lot of it is by young Black and brown folks starting
Mm.
collectives, doing mutual aid. And that just makes me so excited. I have grandchildren. I feel like we do have a future, this
Yes.
is the future, and that the future can be better. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
what's exciting me when I see what people are doing and what's being accomplished.
Oh, wow. Oh, my goodness. Well, you have just offered such a beautiful, beautiful legacy for us, the younger generation, to continue to build on and grow with. We are, I want to affirm everyone who gets to watch this video that we are equipped, right, to go read Collective Courage, to be inspired, to know that our, yes, yes. Oh, my goodness. Such a beautiful, beautiful book, a beautiful reflection of so many of the things that you shared today, right? Like, you really are a source of inspiration, of wisdom, and possibility, right? Knowing
Oh,
that we
thank
are
you
not
so much.
trapped in any system, in any worldview, in any place. No, we are agents. I heard you say, right? We have intersectional analysis, and together there's nothing we can't create and do. So
We
thank
can
you
do it.
so much. Thank you
Oh,
so
thank
much.
you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thanks so much.